like to read and would interest you. And he lent me this book here. I hope you can see it. And I read it, and I was fascinated by the story. I couldn't put the story out of my mind, and I started to research it a bit more myself. And I thought when I put it together, it was worth retelling. And I'm going to just start bang into it now, because when people are listening on Zoom, I don't think the concentration span is just as long as, if you were in a room. So this story, I would call it an epic story. Starts off in the 1980s in a district of Tokyo. And an old lady called Tetsuko was sorting out the contents of a traditional Japanese storage chest known as a nagamochi, which had belonged to her mother-in-law, Masa Suzuki. And she had died nearly 20 years previously. Now, when Tetsuko opened the chest, she found it contained more than 800 letters written on handmade paper in hentai kana style of Japanese, which was no longer used. The letters were written from right to left, all written in columns, and they were tied up with ribbon, and many contained pressed flowers and leaves, which fell out when opened. And when she read the letters, each of which were several feet long, she realized that they had been written by a foreigner because of little grammatical errors and vocabulary mistakes. So the letters were all sealed with wax, with the motto "Swift and Faithful" written in English. So she realized, Tetsuko realized that she'd come across something very, very special in these letters. And after a lot of research in Japan and in Ireland, England, and France, the story of the author of the letters and the recipient was told in this book, Falling Blossom, by Peter Magnamenta and Momoko Williams. Now, I've got in touch with Momoko, and she's been very helpful and given me a wee bit more information on that and some contacts as well. So it was a butcher, John Muldry, lent me the book, and he's the one to blame, and he's away raising his pigeons tonight. So how do these letters found in Tokyo have a connection with our part of the world here in rural County Armagh? Well, the letters were written by Arthur Hart Synnot of Ballymoyer House between Whitecross and Newtown Hamilton. And the letters have a backdrop of the first half of the 20th century. So Hugh, can you show us please on the slides, first of all, the Japanese chest, and secondly then slide 3 and 4 come on to Ballymoyer House. Now the letters, as I say, have a backdrop of the first half of the 20th century, and Arthur's story, as the main person in the story, spans the world really. It takes in South Africa, Japan, Manchuria, Hong Kong, France, England, and Ireland. And it's a story of social divisions, cultural divisions, the workings of the British Empire, 2 world wars, and the partition of Ireland. So I call that an epic story. So I'm going to begin by telling you a wee bit about Arthur's life.
Hello?
Arthur Henry Seton Hart Synnot was born on the 19th of July, 1870. He was the eldest son of Major General Arthur Fitzroy Hart and Mary Synnot.
Get it afterwards.
Right, could maybe somebody needs to go on mute there.
Yeah. Right.
Okay. His brother Ronald said of him, he had a remarkable degree of physical and intellectual prowess, which he developed with great industry. So his family was steeped in the British Empire and the traditions of the British Army. He was educated in King William's College in the Isle of Man, where he excelled at playing sport, cricket, rugby, steeplechase, hurdles, as we call it now, the high jump and the 100 yards. And on his first attempt, he won a place at Sandhurst, where he passed out with honours. He left Sandhurst in 1890 and went to India as a subaltern in the 1st Battalion of the East Surrey Regiment, of which his father was a colonel. After 8 years in India, he returned to go to Staff College. And Queen Victoria, the old Queen, came to review the troops at Aldershot Barracks in 1899, and Arthur's father rode on Arthur's horse with his 2 sons alongside him. So you should have a slide view of Arthur and his brother and his father, the three of them in military uniform. Slide is 5 and 6. The three of them fought in the Boer War, where Arthur and his brother won DSOs. Arthur's horse was killed when he was riding it, so he had a near miss. His father retired after 38 years service and came home to run the estate at Bala Moyer. And Arthur was now promoted to the rank of captain on £230 per annum. So just going to talk very briefly about why the Synods, or how the Synods came to County Armagh. Synod is an old, one of the old Norman names. So it's one of the 12 Norman names that came with the Norman conquest into Ireland. And there was a Synod from Dublin, and he was made registrar of County Armagh in the 1600s. And that's very likely where the connection begins. Walter Synnot built a lodge at Ballymoyer in the 1700s. And eventually the property passed to Arthur's mother on the death of her brother. So you should have a picture there of a Ballymoyer house, a beautiful, there's a Georgian part, and then there were 2 or 3 additions in Victorian times, a beautiful big house in Ballymoyer. Her husband, Arthur's father, Arthur Fitzroy Hart, took on the name of Hart Synnot after his wife inherited the property. So Mary Hart Synnot, they were living in Dorset, and on inheriting the property, Mary brought her pony and trap and her gardener and his family all from Dorset to Ballymoyer. She was a very enterprising woman, and she started a large-scale poultry business, and she won prizes for her butter from her Jersey cows at the local agricultural show. The Domain farm was under the energetic leadership of John Muldrew and was systematically and stimulated and brought up to date. So this John Muldrew, who was the farm manager, was an uncle of John Muldrew, my butcher, his father. So that's where the connection comes. We'll talk about that later on. So I'm quoting from Ronald's family history, written in the 1960s, when he talks about Mr. Muldrew being under a very energetic leader in the estate. Now, Mr. Muldrew and Ronald worked together. They demonstrated the use of fertilizers and a reaper binder machine to the skeptical locals. So they were really pushing forward in farming methods and agriculture in the early 1900s. Now, meanwhile, son Arthur, who's the main guy in our story, was aide-de-camp to his uncle. And a new alliance had just been formed between Britain and Japan in 1902 to stand up to Russian aggression. Got another big slide there, big Russian octopus, Hugh, please. If either Japan or Britain were attacked by a single country, the other country would remain neutral. And if either country was attacked by more than 2 aggressors, then the other country would be obliged to join in on their partner's behalf. So the War Office were looking for those interested to go to Japan and learn the language and observe how the Japanese army worked. And Arthur was selected by the War Office, being already fluent in French and being able to speak some German. So he was a natural linguist. And he started a course on Japanese at London University. So Arthur was the second batch of 4 officers to be sent out to Japan. He spent Christmas at Ballymoyer House, and he attended St. Luke's Parish Church at Ballymoyer on Christmas Day. So we have a picture there of St. Luke's Parish Church, which you'll recognise today. And the beautiful matching stained glass windows in the church were given by Arthur's grandfather. Now, in January of 1904, Arthur set sail for Japan on the Wakusu Maru. The journey was estimated as 47 days. However, while on board the ship, war started between Japan and Russia, with the Japanese attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. And the ship could only go a certain distance, and then he had to get another ship from Java to Japan. Now, when Arthur arrived in Tokyo, he stayed at the Imperial Hotel. The cultural difference must have been enormous beforehand, Arthur had always been in countries which were under British rule. So they're all, for instance, like India was Anglified to a certain extent. But Japan was just emerging from a feudal system. And Arthur, this was a big, big culture change for him. He was impressed by the cleanliness and the courteousness of the people. The women were in traditional kimono dress and they wore wooden clogs. And underneath their kimono, they wore like a petticoat, which pinned their knees together. And this meant that they walked with an unusual shuffling gait. Arthur went to the Kikosha, the Japanese officers' club, to get some news of how the war was going, to try out his Japanese and get a meal. The club was opposite a long cherry-lined slope which ran up to a shrine with the traditional Shinto priests. Arthur was interested in nature and gardening, and it was April, and he noticed a girl looking at a peach blossom tree, and he thought she was very beautiful, and he later told his family that he was smitten immediately. So we're into the story now, and it's really, for Arthur, it's love at first sight. Now you should have a picture of the girl coming up now on a slide. Who was this girl who captured Arthur's heart? Her name was Masa Suzuki. Her father, Kikiro Suzuki, had a barber shop in an old working class district of Tokyo. Masa was the youngest daughter of 7 children, 3 boys and 4 girls. She was literate, numerate and intelligent, and she had left school at 14. She had been taught to bow to males in the family and to eat separately from them. She had obediently entered an arranged marriage to an older man who was a paper wholesaler. And when he decided to divorce her, the little girl they had, as was the custom, went with her father. And Masa was dumped and discarded. In April of 1904, she had gone to live with her second oldest brother, who had a barber shop in the district which contained embassies and government offices. Masa applied for and got a job working as a clerk at the Army Officers' Club. After that first meeting under the peach blossom, Arthur began to see her for outings and picnics. She took him to the old city and brought him back to her family, where they shared green tea on the floor. As Arthur was in the second group of officers to come out from England, he had not yet been posted to the war in Manchuria. He asked Masa to keep house for him and offered to pay her a better wage than she had been earning as a clerk. Initially, her family were against it, but her brothers eventually agreed. It was not an unusual agreement. The girl was a temporary wife. She knew she was a temporary wife, and when the soldier went back home to Britain, the relationship ended. So their house in Asakusa looked over the river. Masa was paid 30 yen or £3 a month, and Arthur experienced Japanese life to the full, ate rice with pickled vegetables and grilled eel as a luxury. The Japanese language was difficult. The verb was at the end of a sentence. The form of words changed according to who you were talking to, honorifics in other words. A teacher came to the house every day and his spoken Japanese advanced. He called Masa Dolly, and they seemed to be very happy together. They both found each other physically attractive. Arthur was shy and a bit of a loner, and he often found English women brash and forward. There was a British community who would have tea parties, play cricket, cards, but he couldn't invite them back to his house because of Masa. That would have been sort of a taboo. Even at this stage, Arthur would rather spend time with Masa than attend these parties with other Westerners. Due to the summer humidity, they left the city and travelled to the area around Mount Fiji. They walked, enjoyed the views, the plants, and they fell deeply in love. In December of 1904, Arthur is to move to Manchuria to observe the war at close quarters. He decided to pay Masa to remain in the house so she need not go out to work, and he sent her his very first postcard. Have arrived in Osaka. I'm so sad to be apart from you. I think about you all the time. He sent another postcard later that day, and so started the correspondence between the two. He then wrote her a proper letter. He has a lock of her hair and he begins to call her darling, and he tells her we will be so happy when the war is over. This was the start of the epic correspondence that culminated in those hundreds of letters which were found in the Nagamochi in Tokyo in the 1980s. Now, in the meantime, Masa rented a smaller house, and she'd taken all Arthur's possessions to be stored in a diplomat's house. The war ended on the 2nd of January 1905, and Arthur is sent back to Tokyo after 5 months of separation. Japan has won, and even British school children get a day off school to celebrate the victory over Russia. And it's at this time when everything Japanese is in the style, is in fashion. Japanese gardens, if you have enough money, you make a Japanese garden at home in Britain. You put Japanese screens up in your house. Japan is really fashionable at the minute, or at this time in Britain, because of the Anglo-Japanese alliance. Arthur receives the Manchuria Medal and from Japan the Order of Sacred Class. Masa's brothers visit. Her mother teases Arthur because of his size, and he falls deeper and deeper in love. He has never before known such a settled period of domestic bliss in his adult life. The British Navy visited. Prince Arthur Connaught came to Japan to confer the Order of the Garter on the Emperor of Japan. Arthur was invited to a party at the newly upgraded British Embassy and bowed to the Emperor. The two lovers went on another trip to the mountains of Yokohama, and they bought plants and bulbs to be shipped to Ballymoyer because Arthur was to go home on leave. Masa rented a smaller house and was always careful about monetary concerns. Now, when Arthur returned home at Ballymoyer, there was great celebrations for his return. He had been picked up at Newry Station by the coachman. And at the talk that I gave in Market Hill, there was a gentleman there whose mother told him that she remembers the Hart Synnot coach going by from Newry Station. They lived at Bestbrook at the time, and the coach went by on its way up to Ballymoyer. The locals and workers pushed the wheels of the carriage up the long drive to the house. We should have a slide of that long drive, and you recognise it today. If you go for a walk at Ballymoyer today, you're walking up that same drive. There was a band playing, there was a fireworks display. Relatives had come to stay for a grand dinner. The Ballymoyer gardens were planted with bamboos and camellias, magnolias, irises and tea bushes. Arthur told his family about Masa. By this time he had received the news that she was expecting a baby. She wrote to him at Ballymoyer, and he posted her many letters from the post office in Whitecross, which I'm sure was, they hadn't had many letters posted in Whitecross all the way going to Japan. He was deeply in love, and he wrote, "From Arthur to the Queen of my heart. English women are different from my darling, and I don't like them. There is only one woman for me in the whole world." The sister Beatrice shopped for clothes to be sent to Japan for Masa, but his parents found the situation harder to understand. Masa gave birth to a baby boy on the 13th of December, but Arthur didn't hear about the birth until February. The baby was given the name Kiyoshi and registered as her brother's child, and then given to Masa for adoption. And there should be another slide there with the picture of Masa and the little baby on her back. Arthur went to London to ask for a posting to Hong Kong. He then returned to Ballymoyer to say goodbye to his parents, and he arrived in Japan in April of 1907, and he and Masa went on a holiday to Kyoto. He told her of his plan to get a house in Hong Kong, and in the several months annual holiday he would come to Japan to live with her. In Hong Kong, he suffered from the high humidity. He built his own house, which was prefabricated in Japan. Masa went to Hong Kong in November of 1908. Arthur came down with malaria, and a cousin, Norman, came out and visited and met and liked Masa. Now, Norman was the only one to actually meet Masa, the only one of the Hart-Synod family. Now, we go back to Ireland now again, and the Land Acts of 1899 and 1902, the tenants on the 7,100 acre estate could now buy their own farms. But as it took a while for prices to be agreed, the estate was way down the list for compensation from the government. Arthur's father was cutting wood in Ballymoyer, and after what was called in those days rupturing himself, he travelled to London for an operation on his local doctor's advice. Unfortunately, 5 days after the operation, he died in London on the 29th of April 1910. And just 4 days later, a military funeral was organised in Ballymoyer, and I'm talking a grand military funeral befitting Arthur's father's rank. Red scarlet tunics parading through White Cross to the church in Ballymoyer. And again, when I gave the talk in Market Hill, there's a gentleman there, and his mother remembers as a small child, remembers this funeral going through White Cross and on to Ballymoyer, military bands and all the rest. Now, Masa wanted Arthur to go back to Ballymoyer, but this would mean he would forego his summer leave with her, and he wasn't prepared to sacrifice this. Masa was pregnant again, and Hideo was born in December and passed off as her brother's child, and again adopted by Masa. Arthur had written to his uncle, Sir Reginald Hart, in the War Office in London, asking to be sent back to Japan, but his uncle replied that this was not possible. He proposed marriage then to Masa, and in 1 month he wrote 10 letters, each letter being 6 feet long. He explained that he needed to stay 3 more years in the army to get a good pension. Masa left her 3-month-old baby to see him in Hong Kong, but she said she wouldn't marry him or go to England, but she would wait for him to come to Japan and live with her. So she cared about her own family, especially her mother. She wasn't prepared to leave her mother and her home country. So she returned to Japan, and she used her sewing machine to earn some extra money, and she lived frugally and grew vegetables. Now, Arthur returned, meanwhile, back again to Ireland, back to Ballymoyer, and visited his father's grave. And his mother was frail and distracted, and his sisters Blanche and Beatrice were running the house. The family had not yet been compensated for the tenants getting ownership of their land. His brother Ronald was running the estate, and Arthur was suffering a bout of ill health from a previous attack of malaria. And in his bedroom in Ballymoyer, he had a shrine to Masa. The family knew about Masa, but not about the boys. He wrote to her speaking about when they'll go fishing together in Ballymoyer. And as you're walking up to Ballymoyer, you can see the little rivers. There's like 3 little rivers joined together. So I'm sure the fishing was better in those days than it is now. He sent her pressed lavender. The doctor told him to extend his leave to aid his full recuperation. He chopped wood and cut lawns on the estate. He planted gooseberries, raspberries and currants, and embarked on a scheme to make a Japanese garden. A pond was excavated, leaving an island, and he diverted a stream to make a waterfall. He began to keep bees, and he made a bridge. He wrote to Masa, "I am building this garden only for you." He spoke again of her coming to Ballymoyer and also of them being together in Japan. Now, in 1912, he had hoped for a posting to Peking, but instead he was to go to Burma with his regiment. It was remote and then a province of India. He bought Masa a ruby ring. The climate was very hot and humid. He realised he could leave the army in 1914 with a pension as a major. In the summer of 1912, he spent his leave with Masa and the 2 boys in a house by the sea which Masa had rented. Arthur had wanted to spend it with Masa alone, but she insisted that the boys come along as Hideo was just beginning to walk. After the summer, he hated being back in Burma. He began learning Burmese to learn some extra rupees, and he passed the language test. He lived frugally, cutting his food and drink bill. He did mention kiyoshi in his letters to Masa, but never Hideo. He spent his summer leave in Japan as usual. In Ballymoyer, his mother was ill with kidney trouble. His brother Ronald wrote to Arthur requesting power of attorney. Masa urged him to go and see his mother, but she died in 1913. And there should be a slide there showing the grave, and you can see this grave if you visit St. Luke's Parish Church today. Ballymoyer was now his. He wrote to his brother to try and rent out the house. His sisters offered to stay on in the house, but he declined their offer as he said it was contrary to their interests. Hamptons came over from London to prepare a booklet for prospective tenants, but no one came forward, and the house was closed and left in the care of Mr. Muldrow the steward and an agent in Newry, Mr. Mears. Now in 1914, the Great War began. The Anglo-Japanese alliance won control of the sea approaches to Peking and North China. Arthur was serving in northern India as a staff officer. Masa sent him parcels, 6 parazoris, sandals, magagami paper, envelopes and silk yarns. And he wrote back to her, I still have 3 pair of sandals, don't send me any more. He had a desk job in charge of internal security. In Singapore in February of 1915, he had to put down a mutiny by 800 Sikh soldiers with the help from Japan. All Arthur's cousins were fighting in Europe in the war, and Arthur felt just out of it. In Japan, the second little boy, Hideo, suffered many infections. Kiyoshi was picked on in his local elementary school because of his height, obviously taking after his father. Hideo was admitted to Tokyo University Hospital for an X-ray, and he died in the middle of December. Arthur had only seen him 3 times. In his letters, he was sorry that the child died because Masa was upset, but he did not seem to mourn the child for himself. He wrote that he wished Ballymoyer was not his because it was a white elephant. Now, 1916 brings the Easter Rising here, of course, in Dublin. The Battle of Jutland took place with the loss of 6,000 sailors, and there was the horrific Battle of the Somme. So I'm just sort of putting it into context here. In October of 1916, Arthur was sent back to Europe. The Japanese Navy was escorting Allied ships in the Mediterranean. Arthur had 2 weeks leave and he met with his family. He was to be sent to France. He wrote his will and he said that 10,000 yen per annum was to be sent to Masa. He saw his family and they accepted his commitment to Masa, but they still didn't know about his son. On the 1st of January, he was sent to Picardy. This was a new type of combat for Arthur with night raids and trench warfare. He was writing to Masa on handmade makagami paper, long letters from the trenches. He hadn't seen her for 3 years, and his sister Beatrice acted as a go-between regarding money being sent to Masa. Arthur was promoted to lieutenant colonel. The Germans retreated behind the Hindenburg line, and America entered the war. Masa's allowance from Arthur wasn't reaching her. Kiyoshi was in private school and he wrote to his father asking for a watch, but Arthur wrote back saying, I can't steal a watch from a German officer, as his son was suggesting. Arthur wrote more than 200 letters to Masa during this period, and he received 180 in return, though some were lost forever to the war. He was now writing to his son. In his leave in May, he returned to Ballymoyer. It wasn't worth opening up the big house, and he stayed with his aunt in Restrever. The gardener and his wife were acting as a caretaker, and the steward was looking after the farm, which was doing slightly better with the inflated prices for corn and potatoes. Arthur returned to fierce fighting. He was commanding officer with the 1st Battalion of the Lancashire Fusiliers. The Ypres offensive failed, but even from the trenches, Arthur writes to his darling Dolly, I cannot bear to be apart anymore. He hoped to be promoted to Brigadier General soon. Again, he was in the thick of the war, and he writes, I'm absolutely exhausted as we are fighting day and night and cannot sleep. I carry my darling's photographs in my breast pocket all the time. In another letter, he writes, the other night I went out on duty and suddenly sank into the mud up to my waist. It was very difficult to pull myself out. There can be no other place in the world as horrible as this. In March, he collapsed with pneumonia, which was a result of an earlier gassing. He was in a critical condition for 3 days and nights. Army doctors sent him home on sick leave, and again he returned to Ballymoyer. When he left again for France, the front line had shifted back to the trench lines of the British Expeditionary Force of 1914. So it was a very demoralizing time for the British Army, because everything had just gone back really to the beginning of the war. He had not seen Masa for almost 5 years, but their correspondence was as faithful as ever. He had applied for a job as a liaison officer with the Japanese army, which was intending to attack the Bolsheviks and secure the Trans-Siberian Railway. He was on the platform at Charing Cross. A staff officer from the War Office came running up to him and asked him if he was still interested in this job. Arthur replied the affirmative, and he was told that he must go to Bologna and wait instructions there. So he was overjoyed at the thought of going to Japan and seeing Masa again, and he wrote to her, "I think I will be in Japan by the time this letter arrives." However, after he returned from posting this letter, he found a telegram with the news that his services were not required. And there's been a suspicion a couple of times during his army career that someone higher up had made decisions and Arthur had been overlooked. And perhaps it's to do with him having this Japanese wife. No one knows for sure. He now realized he would not see Masa again until the war was over. A few hours later, he received another telegram telling him that he had been promoted to Brigadier General. Around dusk on Saturday, May the 11th, Arthur was walking with his brigadier, Major Captain Wright, when a German shell fell on them in an almost direct hit. Captain Wright died and Arthur was conscious, but he knew both his legs were in tatters. Doctors injected pints of salt and water into a vein in his elbow so that his heart could pump something after so much loss of blood. He was taken to the Canadian Field Hospital, where both his legs were amputated above the knee at 3 a.m. He was in a coma, but after 6 days, he was moved via an ambulance train to Rouen, where he was treated in the British 8th General Hospital. He was 47 and most of the casualties were in their teens or 20s. The stumps were excruciatingly painful and the wounds had to be drained regularly. There were flaps of skin that the surgeons had sewn around the thigh bone ends that had yet to heal. His right eardrum had burst and he had nearly lost the sight of his right eye. He had shrapnel in his arm and chest, and flesh had been blown off his back and buttocks. However, in shaky Japanese writing, he wrote to Masa. Beatrice had already written to her a short note informing her that Arthur had been gravely injured and was in hospital. Arthur bravely informed her that within 2 or 3 months the stumps will be harder and he can get artificial legs. He needed another operation as the bone on the left leg was too long. He was getting stronger, having his bed brought outside each day. He sent Masa money for her birthday and photographs of the hospital, and he began the faithful letter writing, numbering each letter and corresponding reply. "Darling, it is going to be difficult to go back to Japan without legs, and you're going to find me ugly." By his letters, he was intending to be in Japan by the early months of 1919. He knew his military career was over and he would not reach the rank of Major General that his father and uncle had. He was sent back to England to Edward VII Hospital and was allowed access to the gardens of Buckingham Palace. Masa received news of his injuries in late June, and her first letter to him arrived on the 18th of August. He wrote to her, "Darling, darling, I have been thinking about you every day, looking at your photographs." Ballymoyer was shut up, there was no electricity, and the gardener left. Arthur moved to a mansion in Bedfordshire, and then a convalescent home in the south of France. Kiyoshi, his son, who was attending a school set up by French missionaries, wrote to him, looking shoes and magic lanterns and swimming trunks. Arthur heard the roars of the crowds on Armistice Day, and 5 days later, he was given temporary legs and wrote to tell Masa about them, adding, "I wish I could learn to walk soon in order to come and live with you. I cannot plan anything until I can walk properly." Now, the next part of the story is difficult to relate, even though I've told this story many times, and it's such a long way from when it happened. But Arthur is in Cannes, recuperating and learning to walk again. He mentions going back to Japan in his letter on the 23rd of March. He begins to speak more about his difficulties than his progress. And when he first arrived in Cannes, he wrote, it would have been wonderful if you had been here with me. Soon, however, his letters begin to get shorter and more formal and negative. There is nothing new, I have to tell you. That is not the Arthur we know, because Masa and he were soulmates, and he shared all his thoughts with her. He stopped sending the pressed flowers. He told her he was going back to England and then to Ireland. There was no mention of Japan. He wrote to her, maybe it would have been better if I had died when I was injured. I am no longer able to leave England, and as I cannot live on my own, I am going to marry an English woman. He tried to reason with her, and it was as if he himself was not convinced of his own actions, and he was maybe trying to justify his actions to himself as well as Masa. I'm sure you will forgive me. If I had not this injury, I was coming back to you. You're a very kind woman, and if you think about my loneliness, I think you will forgive me for marrying. I will not forget my darling for the rest of my life, but we will never be able to see each other again. I cannot express in words how difficult this is. And with a heavy heart, I write, but I had to write sooner or later. Please forgive me. Please forgive me. Sad Arthur. The relationship which had survived so many partings now seemed to be over. It is hard to understand Arthur's sudden change. We can only go by his letters and see that he seems to be wanting a companion to look after him. He doesn't mention falling in love, and he doesn't mention any change in his feelings towards Masa. So perhaps he's going to marry for companionship or a nurse, you know. Anyway, Masa is, as you can imagine, completely amazed at this and horrified, and her first reaction is to come to London. Now, the girl whom Arthur is going to marry, got engaged to, I have been in contact with her niece's daughter, and she very kindly shared some photographs with me. And I have some of them, all of them except for one in the slideshow. The one I haven't put in the slideshow is his wedding photograph, and I feel that it's a very personal photograph, and I don't feel I can share it without permission, because I just think it's too personal. So I've shared all the rest of the photographs with you. So who is this girl that Arthur got engaged to? Well, Arthur's engagement to Violet Drower was announced in the Times on the 3rd of June, and Arthur did not write to tell Masa this news until the 8th of June. So his last letters to her were lies. He did not tell her the truth about his plans. And when he writes to her, he says, I have told my future wife about you, and she understands. She is called Violet. I would like to be kind to you as before. I have thought about you a lot. Please forgive me. The marriage will be on the 3rd of July. Sayonara from Arthur to darling Dolly. Arthur's injury had been reported in the London newspapers the previous summer. His rank also meant that Queen Victoria's son, the Duke of Connaught, now in Cannes, asked Arthur to call. He was very well connected to the top of British society, and yet he had loved with a passion a poor Japanese girl. Violet Drower, who was a trained sister working with the Red Cross, helped in Arthur's recuperation in Cannes. Her nickname was Chai, and even I was talking to the niece, and even in her family, Chai was the name she was known by, apparently from the china blue of her eyes. She was 33 and had never been married before. Her father was a London surveyor, and she spoke fluent French. In a very short time, 6 or 7 weeks after they met, she and Arthur decided to get married. The ceremony took place in St. Paul's Church in London, and the wedding was reported in detail in the Newry Reporter as a society wedding. And I think, Hugh, there's a wee slide showing the clip out of the Newry Reporter. Arthur's brother Ronald stood close to him while he was making his vows and supported him when needed. Ronald says of the Chai, only one compensation came to my brother, but it was a great one, referring to Arthur's marriage. There was a 10-day motoring honeymoon in Wales, and they arrived in Ballymoyer on the 13th of July, 1919. They stayed with Arthur's aunt in Rostrevor while Ballymoyer was made ready for them. Chai took over the revival and modernisation of the house. Arthur had long walks with the steward John Muldrew, who was running the farm. They had dairy cows and they grew oats and wheat. Ireland was tense in the aftermath of the rising, and he could not get a local couple, so his English batman Tansley and his wife came to live with them. There were now only 325 acres and the big house. The compensation from the government to the tenants was less, the tenants was less than they had been promised, and it was used to pay off an historic mortgage. 90 acres sloping onto the Newton-Hamilton Road was put up for sale at £42 an acre. He auctioned off farm equipment and installed a new sawmill to cut beech, spruce and fir. He also started a poultry business, but times were difficult. The rector at Lisnadill, not far away, had been shot, and there were killings in Newry. Arthur still wrote to Masa, but not regularly, and he posted his letters from the post office in Whitecross, saying of the wedding, "I was very pleased with the wedding, and I hope you feel the same." So obviously tact wasn't a strong point of Arthur's. She accused him of misleading her and betraying her. She said she was coming to London to marry him, and the only thing to stop her would be if he would send her 10,000 yen. She asked him why he did not ask her to come to London when he realised he could not go to Japan. She said she had to fight for her son, and he asked her did she think of him as a cold and cruel man. He posted shoes from Whitecross for Kiyoshi. For Masa, her son was the sole focus of her life. Arthur had never been a very intimate father, once writing to Masa, "The children are lovely, but life would be freer without them." In January of 1920, he had a letter from Masa. He no longer called her darling, and he made no inquiry about his son. Masa said she wished to treat him like a brother and sent the lace shawl to Chai, which Arthur had once given her. It was during this time that he came to the church that I attend, St. John's Mullabrack, and he unveiled the War Memorial tablet. And there's a slide of this here, Hugh. So when I'm in church and I look across at the War Memorial tablet, you know, I've got that personal link with Arthur coming to our church and unveiling it. This was given front page headlines in the Ulster Gazette. And again, that should be on a slide as well, Hugh, made front page of the local newspaper. Towards the end of 1920, Arthur left the Tansleys and John Muldrew in charge, and he set off to London, Morocco, Tangier and Cannes. And if he did all this travelling, there is a possibility he could have travelled to Japan. He bought a villa between Cannes and Nice in the south of France. His car was converted for him to drive, and he worked the clutch with his back. He could go swimming in the warm Mediterranean, and he enjoyed the company of other expats living along the south coast of France. And there should be a picture here of him at a sort of a social gathering, Arthur with some other lady, and then his wife, Chai, is with another gentleman, sort of at a big dinner. In 1922, he withdrew his servants from the house, and Mr. Muldrew was left in sole charge. Now, you imagine the times in Ireland here in 1922, so War of Independence, and things are very, very unsettled. Northern Ireland has just been, Northern Ireland's only a year old, the Northern Ireland state has just been created, so very turbulent times in Ireland. He reduced the allowance to Masa from 800 to 400 yen per month. Masa moved back to Tokyo and opened a sandwich shop because Arthur had taught her how to make sandwiches, but this venture just lasted a year. They almost gave up writing, and in a 17-month period, there was only one letter. The Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed. There were terrible times in Ireland, and on Ballymoyer House on the 1st of July was commandeered by the Auxiliary Police Constabulary of the Northern Government. That would be what we would call the A Specials. An officer and 60 men presented themselves at the door, and they forced Mr. Muldrew to give them admission. Mr. Muldrew went into Newry to see Mears the agent, and Ronald telegraphed to take out and store as much of the contents of the house as possible. The invaders proceeded to at once convert the premises into fortified barracks for themselves. Many smaller items were lost or appropriated by the upholders of the law, and many others sent to auction rooms in Belfast and sold at a loss. Both Beatrice and Ronald went to Ballymoyer to see for themselves what had happened. Letters were flying among Mr. Muldrew, Arthur, Ronald and Beatrice. Arthur was demanding compensation for this outrage and loss of business from the sawmill. And I have letters here that are copies of letters, or a letter that's been held in the museum in Armagh as well about this period. The invaders eventually left. Two representatives of the new Northern government were sent to London to negotiate with Ronald and Mears and the family solicitors. And Ronald writes, I had expected that the Northern government, whose police had ravaged the home of a distinguished and severely wounded soldier, would be full of apologies and desire to pay a generous compensation. Quite the contrary attitude of the two officials. In addition to an agreed rent, 5,000 was given as a lump sum, and this was passed to Arthur. Now, the offer of a housebreaker to level the site of the house and to pay £50 for materials was accepted, and the remaining outbuildings were disposed of. So you should have a slide with Mr. Muldrew and two other younger men with him up on the balcony of Ballymoyer before it was razed to the ground. One of the younger chaps in that picture there, in that slide, is John Muldrew the butcher, is his father. So that's the connection. So that was probably taken just before the house was razed to the ground. A beautiful house, just flattened. And again, at the talk I gave in Market Hill, there was an old lady there, and she remembers a Sunday school outing, and they were taken to that house to have a, in the grounds of the house to have a picnic. And don't forget, Arthur, at that time, the Japanese garden that he had made and was tending was still, was being developed and maturing. Now, that left the avenue and the glen of 49 acres. So that avenue, that when you go to Ballymoyer today and take a walk, you're walking up that avenue. In 1938, it was offered to the National Trust, the management being transferred to the Forestry Commission. And the park and Japanese garden were planted over with pine trees. And in later years, car parks were made for visitors. Arthur began to write to Masa regularly again, first on a monthly and then on a fortnightly basis. They exchanged presents such as winter underwear, a pruning saw, and she sent him seeds and bulbs. In letters, they go over times in the past. He sends parcels to his son, sealed with the wax and the Synod crest. He sends 200 yen and then 350 yen to his son. At a second attempt, Kiyoshi is admitted to Japan's Imperial University, and he is the school's leading athlete at short and middle distance, and he beats the Japanese record for 800 meters. And Masa sent a newspaper cutting to Arthur, and he wrote back saying that he too was a good runner at school. Masa moved house to be near her son, who studied law. And when he graduated, he moved to Tokyo University to study philosophy. Kiyoshi then went to a French university for 3 years. The boat stopped at Marseille, but he got the train to Paris. Obviously, there was not much warmth on both sides of the father-son relationship. Masa encouraged him to visit his father, and when he eventually agreed, she told him to behave himself, and he replied, I am the son of a remarkable mother. You've no call to be telling me that, in other words. In Japan, there was a marked move towards militarism. All foreign students were being recalled, and on his way home, Kiyoshi took the train to see Arthur. He had not seen his father for 25 years. And he wrote to his mother, I was overwhelmed when I saw him. I thanked him for all the things he had done. I forgot all my old grievances once I saw what a kind person he was. Kiyoshi stayed 2 nights with Arthur and Chai. He was moved when he went into the study and saw a photograph of his mother, mementos of their time together, piles of letters and Japanese dictionaries. In the summer of 1939, Arthur travelled to London for a leg fitting, and because of the Second World War, was unable to return to France. His brother Ronald was bursar at St. John's College, Oxford. Arthur and Chai stayed at the President's Lodge at the college. All Arthur's possessions were in France. The house was taken over by the Germans and all his personal artifacts lost. Arthur continued to send money to Japan right up until the Pearl Harbor attack on the United States in 1941. Now, in Japan, Kiyoshi married his fiancée Tetsuko in April of 1941. He was an announcer on the radio, but had to follow the Japanese propaganda machine. He had inherited his father's gift for languages, as now that Japan is fully involved in the war, Kiyoshi was drafted into the army as a private in the 10th Heavy Field Artillery Regiment. He was to learn Russian while he was serving in Manchuria. The Japanese had invaded China in 1937, and the war there had been going on for 4 years when America attacked. Kiyoshi was not interested in writing to an officer. Now, in Tokyo in March of 1945, 300 B-29 bombers flew over, dropping incendiary bombs and killing over 100,000. And after the 2 atomic bombs were dropped, Russia invaded Manchuria. Kiyoshi was in a regiment which surrendered and were taken 800 miles from Vladivostok in cattle trains to build the Gulag for Japanese prisoners. His family did not know his whereabouts and whether he was alive. Masa and Tetsuko bought a house together, and Tetsuko became the principal of a school. In 1945, when the war was over, Masa received a letter from Beatrice, Arthur's sister, telling her that Arthur had died of a heart attack back in 1942. She sent a newspaper obituary cutting and asked if Masa wanted any of his possessions, but Masa declined. She was still living in hope that her son was alive, and she became more and more religious, praying every day. Now, in 1947, the first of the Japanese prisoners were released from Russian camps, and Tetsuko heard from one of them about Kiyoshi. Kiyoshi had collapsed with a fever while doing hard manual labor and was taken to a military hospital. He translated for the Russian doctor, even though he was very ill himself. On Christmas Eve 1945, he asked a young soldier to take a message to Tetsuko, sending her his love and wishing her good luck, and to thank Masa for all that she had done for him. He passed away later that night. Tetsuko never told Masa that her son had died. Masa herself died in 1965, almost 60 years after Arthur had returned to her from his first trip to Manchuria. She had the chance to marry him in 1911, but had listened to her family and turned his offer to become Mrs. Hart Synnot down. She had put her family's wishes first. Arthur had put his own needs first when he married Chai, saying he was grateful that she had taken him on. Nowhere does he say he loves Chai, so it may have been a marriage of convenience. But of course, there is a lovely picture there. If you go on a wee bit, there's a lovely picture of them that the family gave me of Violet or Chai and Arthur at Bala Moyer after they returned. And there's a special bicycle that Arthur is on. And an old lady remembers, an old gentleman's mother remembered Arthur going about in that specially adapted bicycle contraption when he was at Ballymoyer. Now, Arthur and Masa's amazing story of love spans continents, class, culture, religion, and war. I think Arthur's love for Masa was incredible, but he found it difficult to share her love with his boys, and he wanted her exclusively for himself. He certainly lacked warmth as a father, and there was a selfishness in his love for Masa, in that while it was deep, very deep love, he couldn't put her needs above his own, and therefore when he was injured, the prime motives for his actions were to serve his own needs. Now, there's a whole lot of, you could say, if this happened, if that happened, if the Troubles hadn't happened in Ireland, hadn't caused the ruin of Ballymoyer, perhaps we would be able to visit the beautiful mansion today. And if Arthur hadn't been injured, it is likely that his love for Masa would have survived. If there hadn't been a Second World War, would the grandchildren of Kiyoshi be living in Ballymoyer today? Perhaps Masa would have come to Ballymoyer, and today in 2021, there would be a beautiful Japanese garden as a lasting testament to a love which had endured so much. So folks, that's the end of my talk. So thank you very much.
Lorna, thank you very, very much for relating that remarkable story to us.
Okay. Hugh, have you got to the end of the slides? Yeah, run on down there, just run on down them. That's, yep, so you've got the Newry reporter there, the death of, go on ahead down a wee bit more just to, that is the plaque on the wall where Arthur died when he was in Oxford. So that's his memorial stone. Run on down there, Hugh, please. That's the house where John Mulderry lived in after the Bell family bought the house. So, yep, and that's this is Edsel Mulderry, Edsel's daughter Joy, Harry Bell, and a nephew, and we visited Bala Moyer there just last year. So that's us up at the place just last year. Go on ahead. I can't read that too well. Go on ahead. This is where we think the previous one there was where we think the sawmill was. This is the gardens today. Yep, go on ahead there. And this is the spot where the house was today. So the house was here. You see this flattened part. So this is where the house was today, or is, you know, where it was. And if you go on, Hugh, just, yep, clearly see a big flat place. And this is the Japanese gardens today. So I don't know. I think it's a good enough story to be made into a film. Liam Neeson to play the leading part, and Sir Kenneth Branagh to direct. But I really do think it's a great story. And you know, go to Ballymoyer for a walk and just imagine all that happened there. Thank you.
Again, thank you very much, Lorna. Yes, remarkable story, and yet so sad, really, in its ending. Vicissitudes of war and international politics and everything, almost impossible to surmount. But is anyone any question to ask, Lorna?
Just unmute yourself before you you ask, please.
I would just like to say thanks very much, Lorna.
You're welcome. It's a story I like to tell.
Yes, I can fully understand why. But if there's no more questions, I want to close proceedings formally and thank you all for joining us tonight. And we will keep in touch and let you know when our next organized gathering or meeting is going to be held and where. So good night to you all, and thank you again, Lorna. Night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorna. That was just a wonderful story. Terrific story altogether and beautifully told.
Thank you, Barbara.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for doing that and for being willing to do it on Zoom, which is just not quite the same, but wonderful for us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well,